Hi everybody, we are going to go through this pre-reading presentation. It just contains some background information and some context in addition to the presentations that you and your classmates did to get us ready to read Mockingbird. So To Kill a Mockingbird is a picture of 1930s American society seen through the eyes of Scout Finch, who is an 8-year-old girl in Macomb, Alabama. So that's why we did so much research into kind of what life was like in the 1930s. It's just very different than our current world. And you really have to kind of put yourself into that society in order to understand what's happening in the book. Scout's world is divided, segmented, and separated by social class, race, gender, and age. And so you'll see all throughout the book the way that different social classes treat each other, different races treat each other, different genders are treated, different age groups are treated. So although a lot of times people tend to focus on the racial disparity that is represented in the book, you also see it, and you see stereotypes among all different types of people in the book. So it could be, younger people being looked down upon by older people, or women having different societal roles than men, or being expected to act different ways than men. Just sort of like a fear of people who don't act in the way that society thinks that they should. So we'll really see all 4 of these throughout the book. To Kill a Mockingbird is also a Bildungsroman. So this is a big fancy word for basically a novel that is about growing up and maturing. So Bildung is from German, means maturing. Roman means novel. So a Bildungsroman is a novel about maturing. In a Bildungsroman, the central character grows from a state of innocence and naivete to one of experience and enlightenment. And we will see that both for Scout and for Jem to a certain extent, as they come to realize things about their town, about their father, about themselves that maybe they didn't know before. So it is a coming of age novel. It's about the journey of growing up. You will see our narrator kind of go through that process. Okay, so just some background and history of the novel. It is one of the best-selling books in the nation's history. It won the Pulitzer Prize after it came out. It's been translated into more than 40 languages, been made into an enormously popular movie, and librarians across the country voted it the best novel of the 20th century. So it definitely has its accolades. It is definitely also met with controversy. It's frequently one of the most banned books books that people attempt to ban the most, and a lot of that is kind of unwarranted, I think. But we'll kind of try to look into sort of the reasons behind why people maybe say that it shouldn't be read, the people who say that it should be read, and so on. It's frequently cited by readers as the book that has made the biggest difference in their lives, and there's a couple of reasons for that. So through the lives of the children who are the focus of the book, it allows us as the reader to walk around in the shoes of people who are different from ourselves. And the novel also challenges stereotypes. So stereotypes of what a Southerner is, African Americans, people who are eccentric, children, what a young lady should be. So the book is really a lot about stereotypes and prejudices and sort of breaking or challenging some of those stereotypes of what you might think, right? Is like, the weird, kind of strange neighbor. There's more to that person than just being kind of the eccentric person down the street. So, and same goes for all of the different characters in the story. There's a lot more to them than just sort of the stereotype of what you see on the surface. The setting is defined by 2 things, the American South and the Great Depression. So we've talked already in our presentations about the American South and what life was like living in the South at this time period. The story takes place in Macomb, Alabama. This is a fictional town, but it is based on Harper Lee's hometown. And then the Great Depression, we talked about that as well. The poverty that was really affecting everyone in the country. So not just Not just poor people were suffering, even people who were previously well-to-do were now having to find ways to cut back and to survive with less. So it affected everyone quite a bit, and we will see the effects of that throughout the novel as well. Okay, so we're just going to kind of talk about how Scout's world is different than ours. And the first thing we're going to look at is just prejudice. So we can identify with Scout's character and her experiences, right? She's an 8-year-old girl. We've all been 8 years old before. She's going to school for the first time. She's, dealing with her brother who's bothering her. She's making friends. These are all things that we can relate to. But her world is dramatically different than ours. So in today's world, we discourage prejudice, right? Like, it's not a good thing to be prejudiced. And we encourage everyone to be treated, fairly and equally. In Scout's world, prejudice was assumed, it was acknowledged, and it was even encouraged. There were laws that enforced prejudice, and we talked about the Jim Crow laws in the presentations, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about them because they are so important to understanding the cultural context of the story. So it wasn't unusual for someone to be prejudiced, right? Like now, if someone said something that was prejudiced, we might be like, hey, that's not cool. But back then, it was assumed, it was acknowledged, it was encouraged and accepted. So the Jim Crow laws are a racial caste system, basically just a system that separates people into different levels of society and says, who's on top, who's on bottom. It primarily operated in the southern states, but not exclusively. So there were northern states that did have Jim Crow laws as well, from about 1877 through the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement. And some people would argue that the effects of Jim Crow laws are still being felt today in our modern society. So basically, states could impose legal punishments on people for having social contact with members of another race. There were laws that ordered business owners and other public institutions to keep their Black and white clients separated. And this is where the idea of separate but equal came in through a lawsuit called Plessy versus Ferguson, which said that separate but equal was acceptable. That actually stayed in place until the 1950s with Brown versus Board of Education, which finally struck that down and said that it is not equal to have people separated by race, that is inherently unequal. So under the Jim Crow laws, Black Americans were not allowed to vote. All interaction between races was restricted. So like water fountains, public restrooms, there had to be like a white and a Black restroom, water fountain, etc. And you can see some of these signs that these are actual signs that were hung up in different places. Marriage, you couldn't have marriage between the races. You had to marry, if you were white, you had to marry someone white. If you were Black, you had to marry someone Black. Hospitals, churches, prisons, public schools, all of these things. So you couldn't even go to church with someone who wasn't the same race as you, or you had to have a separate church for them. Separate accommodations were often inferior to those given to whites. So again, although you could say, okay, well, it's separate, but they're equal, that often wasn't happening. So, the white school was, nice and had all of the accommodations that they needed, and the Black school might be just, kind of very bare bones. Oftentimes also there were just no facilities offered at all for Black Americans, and so then they couldn't use anything. Also, just societally, like a Black man could not offer to shake hands with a white male. It would imply that they were socially equal. And a Black male certainly could not offer his hand to a white woman. He could be accused of rape. He could be accused of assaulting her. So it was very, it's not just this separation. It's like this entire social, they are completely separated away socially, physically, and everything, which is just so different than what our world is like now. So you just have to understand sort of how this system of ordering people really separated people and really encouraged prejudice and encouraged those stereotypes to proliferate and to be widely held beliefs. So another thing to consider with with Jim Crow laws is that oftentimes there would be lynch mobs. And so these would be groups of people who were directing their hatred against one or sometimes several victims. So the victim, could be anything. It could be a Black man who had tried to vote, or who had looked at a white woman, or who had tried to get a white man's job. And they would, these groups of typically men, but I don't want to say that it was always all men, but these groups of white people would attack, pretty viciously, a Black person for doing something that was perceived to be improper. Oftentimes they would be killed. Sometimes they would just be, very, very gravely injured. But it's important to understand what a lynch mob is. We will see a scene with a lynch mob in the book. So I just want you to kind of be aware of what that is. Okay, so the use of the N-word in the book is something that we need to address. It should be no surprise that a novel that is set in the racist atmosphere of the 1930s in Alabama does contain use of the N-word. It's right to feel uncomfortable with this word. Like when you see it, it makes me feel uncomfortable. It will probably make you feel uncomfortable. That's okay. We need to acknowledge that, this is something that happened in our past. We can't ignore it and we can't pretend that it didn't happen. We have to acknowledge it, face it, and then, see how we can be better in our modern world. The use of this word does not mean that Harper Lee was racist. It doesn't mean anything other than that it's her responsibility as the author to reflect the beliefs and the language of the people that she's writing about. And so you will see in the novel, Atticus, Scout's father, he actually kind of makes a point at some point in the novel about how, people who use that word are uneducated and are, sort of lower class and should be like kind of looked down upon. So the message of the novel overall is definitely anti-racist, but the word is in there. So I just want you to be prepared that it is there. But I also want to say that it's not something that is acceptable to use in our modern society. You cannot use it in class. If you're reading a quote directly from the book or you're writing a quotation from the book, then yes, that's understandable. But it's not an acceptable word to say in any other context in our classroom. So I just want to kind of put it out there. That's why this is one of the reasons that the book is frequently challenged and is frequently banned, is that people don't want to have, people exposed to this word. But like I said, it's sort of doing a disservice to the people who lived through these things to pretend like it didn't happen. It did happen. People did say it. And we know better now, so we have to do better. Okay, next we're going to talk about the social expectations that were very different at this time. So in the 1930s in Alabama, there were very specific social expectations. Children had to be very polite to all white adults. Any adult would have the right to scold or punish any child for being disrespectful. So it's not like, okay, well, you're not my dad, so I can say whatever I want to you. Any adult could scold you or punish you if you were being disrespectful. People were expected to be friendly and hospitable to one another. On Sundays, neighbors would go and visit one another. It would be rude to have your doors closed. That looks like you don't want to socialize. So everyone would have their doors open. You would go around the neighborhood and socialize with each other. Everybody went to church. Men would work to support their families, while women would stay at home and care for their families, visit with friends. And anyone who didn't do these things was viewed with suspicion. So we'll see one of the families in the story does not do these things, and they're automatically assumed like there has to be something weird with them. There has to be something wrong with them, that they don't want to go do these things. When in reality, they just are quiet and are introverted and don't want to go out. So you'll see that anyone who doesn't follow these social expectations is really looked down upon. So the social hierarchy in Maycomb really breaks down like this if you think about it as a pyramid. So the people who are given the most respect are the families related to the original settlers of Maycomb County. So that would be like Scout's family and some other families as well. Then you would have like farmers and professionals. Then you would have the Ewells. That's a family that we'll meet in the story. Their level of society, so they're called the disgrace of Maycomb. They're trash, so they don't really work. They just kind of live off of the state or, live in really, really abject poverty. And then below that, you would have minorities. And so you just have to keep in mind that the Jim Crow laws and this racist society that minorities are seen at the very bottom of the social hierarchy in this time period and in this story. And, everyone kind of looks down upon everyone else. So like, even though these people are, not that high up, they're still going to look down on others. It's sort of like someone is worse off than them and they're going to look down upon them. So even though this world might sound kind of stifling and cruel, there are still good things about it. Neighbors would help one another through tough times, and we'll see that several times through the story. The community is close-knit, so even though everyone does kind of know everybody else's business, they also care about each other and want to take care of each other. And then there are people who don't share the community's prejudices and who fight against them. And so those are really the heroes of the story, and they're portrayed that way intentionally, because those are the people that we are supposed to, through reading, want to emulate, the people who fight against the racism and fight against the prejudice and the stereotypes that exist in that community. Here's just a couple pictures of what, life might have looked like in the 1930s. Here's like a main street with businesses, and you can see what the cars looked like. And then here's just a person out, tending their yard, just so you can kind of have an idea of what you can visualize as we're reading. Okay, so our narrator is Scout Finch. And again, she's an 8-year-old girl at the beginning of the story. She is a first-person narrator, and there's a lot of use of flashbacks. So Scout has matured over the years. She's looking back on this that happened in her childhood, and she's kind of commenting on the innocence that she displayed and her thoughts and actions as a young girl. She mostly tells of her thoughts, but we do also learn a little bit about what her brother Jem is thinking as well. So the tone of the story is starts out kind of childlike, humorous, and innocent, right? She's an 8-year-old girl. That's kind of what you would expect. But then as the novel progresses, it does take place over the course of about 3 years. So it does start to get a little bit more dark and foreboding, and a little bit more critical of society and what she sees in her Southern, upbringing, and, starts to be a little critical of that. Harper Lee bases Scout somewhat on herself. Scout's father is an attorney. Harper Lee's father was an attorney. Harper Lee also grew up in a small town in Alabama. So there's definitely something of Harper Lee in Scout. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about is just some of the major thematic ideas. So a theme you will always write out in a sentence form, but these are kind of the ideas that you would base your thematic statements on. So these are just kind of the ideas, and you'll want to pay attention just to how these things progress through the novel. So prejudice is the most obvious thematic idea in the story. And again, it's prejudice related to all 4 of those areas that we talked about at the beginning: social class, race, gender, age. It really has to do with all 4. Equal justice, courage. Courage is another really big one. Moral courage, physical courage, mental courage. Social ostracism, which means like exclusion, sort of like treating someone as the other, and not including them. Maturation, like we talked about, this is a Bildungsroman, so it is a story about growing up. Heroism, I mentioned that before as well. The characters who actively work against prejudice and against racism are the heroic characters in the novel. Friendship, and then innocence and what can happen to it. So kind of like the maintaining innocence versus the loss of innocence as you grow up and mature. So that is the introduction to the book. We're going to start off with reading chapter 1, which is going to give us really just kind of a background exposition to the characters, the people, the setting of Maycomb and Scout and Jem and their father Atticus.